Good evening and welcome to episode 13 of SCOTONOMICS. We've got a fantastic show tonight, and we've got a 50-minute video for you to play. So we're starting bang on time tonight, and we're going to get into the video as soon as we can. But welcome to SCOTONOMICS. Every couple of weeks during this COP week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and we're also helping out on a show on Thursday and Friday. We try and bring you the view of economics from across the planet, and talk about the things that we really need to discuss when we're considering Scotland and the economy of Scotland. And to do that, I'm always joined by my co-host, Karen van Sweden. Hello, Karen. How are you
Hello,
doing?
I'm good. Yeah. So really interesting guest tonight. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the very funny Joe McGreeny, who tweeted today that the best thing that could happen at COP26 is for Greta and Nicola to meet up. Apparently, he thinks the resulting explosion of Gaminati electric rage would power the planet for decades, which I thought was actually very funny.
Yes, it is, and I'm sure it's correct as well. Well, maybe we can use that what was it, electric rage, to power our economy rather than oil and gas, and that's the subject of what we're going to talk about tonight. A fantastic interview that we did it's a couple of weeks ago now, because so in demand was Ben, and we actually got Ben just after he'd presented his paper about the American oil and gas industry and the kind of lifting the lid on what had happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s in terms of delay and denial. We got him in between that and the one that he co-authored about the big oil in France, who'd done exactly the same thing. So I don't know how you feel, Kieran, but I feel we were incredibly lucky to get him. I mean, he's completely in demand now, CNN type style person he's in. So we've been really lucky to get him, and we really enjoyed the interview. He was such a nice guy, wasn't he?
Oh, lovely guy, yeah. And Scotonomics was there first. Yay.
Yeah, we did. We got him first. I really hope you enjoy this interview. If you can't see it all, it'll stay on the channel for as long as we're here, and you can drop back in. But there's some absolute nuggets in here, and it's an incredible story, and he's a really good storyteller as well. So over to you, Karen, for the introduction.
So, Ben Franta is a Stanford PhD student of the history of science. He's working on the history of climate politics and the role of science in policy making. Franta is also an associate at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, where he earned a PhD in applied physics. So, he has two PhDs, and he's going to tell us some interesting things tonight.
Yeah, he's probably the smartest person we've had on Scotonomics, isn't he? Okay, enjoy the interview, everyone. Ben Franta, thanks very much for joining us on Scotonomics as we build up to COP26 in my hometown of Glasgow. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. Um, Before we get stuck into your amazing paper, which is how I found you and we got you to come on to the show, I'd like to mention a couple of things. The first thing being, you might not be aware of this, but last month, Aberdeen University announced that they would be divesting from fossil fuel extraction companies. And this comes after an 8-year-long campaign from Aberdeen students and the People and Planet Network. Now, this is a big announcement in itself, but considering Aberdeen is at the heart of the oil and gas industry in the UK, it's got the potential to have an even bigger impact. And of course, it comes only the month before COP, which, as I said, takes place in Scotland. Now, considering, I believe you were arrested while at Harvard for demonstrating for divestment, I take it this will bring a smile to your face?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's so important. Harvard recently divested as well after a 9-year long campaign. And when I was there, we tried all sorts of different strategies. We tried different forms of protest, including civil disobedience. So some of us were arrested. And, you know, uh, I want to mention that research has also looked at, what is necessary to do from an investment standpoint to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and they all find that investors have to reduce their investments in fossil fuels. So it's really it's really important that institutions take that seriously and do divest. And so it is really great to hear that news. And I think we're going to just see more and more divestment announcements because there's really very little excuse or reason anymore to remain invested in fossil fuels.
Okay, it's a little bit more of an open door, isn't it, that we're pushing now? Kieran's actually lives in Aberdeen, so it was very close to her heart and close to her home. Building on that, I feel really lucky to be speaking to two such influential campaigners against big oil. Now, as you know, because I forwarded you some information, Kieran has been part of a case brought against the UK government under the Pay to Pollute campaign, and as we've just covered, you had a role in the divestment movement in the US. Now, I'd like to actually ask both of you, if that's okay, Kieran, how important is individual action and group action by campaigners against the fossil fuel industry, and what more can we do? But Ben, if you want to go first on that.
You know, I try to view individual and group action as being, synergistic. We don't have to choose between them. Of course, we all look inside of ourselves to decide, what we're going to do with our lives, what we're going to do with our time on Earth, how we're going to apply ourselves. And, that's an individual thing. But at the same time, we usually have the most impact when we join together with others, towards a common goal. And so that's how I try to view it. And I think often when we talk about individual or group action, what we sometimes mean is consumer action, making it trying to make a difference as a consumer, or political action. That sometimes it's code for those things actually. And again, I think it's clear that making decisions purely, from a consumer standpoint is not adequate to address climate change, that we also have to be political. We have to organize ourselves politically. But of course, you know, it's important to, make those consumer decisions if we can as well. So there's not a contradiction between the two. We can do both and, apply ourselves in whatever way that we can. And the way that one way that I think about this sometimes, and this brings us back to the divestment movement, is identifying a goal that currently seems impossible, that currently seems hard to imagine. Like 10 years ago, divestment was pretty unheard of, and it seemed very radical, and hard to imagine that big institutions would actually do this. And so identifying that goal that is still possible, it's possible in some universe, and if it comes to pass, it's going to make a difference. It's going to shift the paradigm of how we deal with climate change. And then, joining together with other people and pushing towards that goal, even if it takes years to make that difference. And that's sort of one way that I try to think about, what's effective in terms of acting on climate change. But of course, there's no authoritative answer. It's a creative question. It's for all of us to use our imaginations and try to figure out, what should we do? What is the most effective thing we can do? So I'd love, those are my thoughts for whatever they're worth, but I'd love to hear yours as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, individual action is important, but really, we are in a situation where we have an existential threat to our lives, and this is why government needs to step in, and why I feel strongly about taking the UK government to court to try and shake them out of their neoliberal, quite libertarian thinking. About that somehow the markets will solve this problem. The markets will not solve this problem. This has to be viewed as a warlike effort. All governments need to step up now, do the deficit spending, get the Green New Deals going. And this has to happen now. It should have happened long ago.
In the UK, after hearing our, I hate to say it, but our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and also the Chancellor, I don't think we've had a government that seems as far removed from the climate crisis as we have now. What more can we do, should we do, especially thinking about COP?
It's a really good question. And it kind of brings us to, what do the COP meetings do? And I think it is time for a sort of maybe a reevaluation of the COP process. And I don't mean this to criticize the process, but just looking at the history of it, I mean, it's been, about 30 years or so, almost 30 years of meetings. And we have to ask ourselves, what have they accomplished? And, if they're not accomplishing enough, then how can we change them to do more? And, of course, the Paris Agreement was extremely important. That provided a global standard or a benchmark for countries to use, and even for courts to use. We're seeing courts of law now seeking to enforce the requirements of the Paris Agreement. So that's very important. But at the same time, I think it's also important that we don't accept as good enough COP meetings that are primarily public relations events, or a time to make announcements that could happen anyway, that would have or could have happened anyway. So that's not to level criticism at the process, but it's just to look at it and really ask yourselves, what's being accomplished, and how can we accelerate action. But again, I'd love to hear what you think as well, because it's not something that I interact with much. I personally have never gone to a COP meeting or anything like that.
Ben, your paper, Weaponizing Economics, illustrated how the fossil fuel industry has funded, highlights the need for all of us to better scrutinise what economists are saying.
Yes, in a word, yes. And in this history, this this recent article, it just traces the history of a pretty small group of economists. It was like three or four people primarily, working through an economic consulting firm in the US. And they had been hired by the American Petroleum Institute, by other groups in the oil industry, to write these reports evaluating how much getting off of fossil fuels would cost. So every time there was a climate policy proposed in the United States, like a carbon tax, even back in the early 1990s, uh, these economists would be hired by the oil industry to say, this is how expensive it's going to be. And they always said it's going to be too expensive, basically don't do it, don't implement this policy. And it was very successful. And the oil industry went back to these same economists again and again and again for, now essentially 30 years. And so it's very important to scrutinize what's happening. And of course, it's not just that they were hired by the oil industry. Their models themselves were designed in a way so that they could only find this answer, that climate policy would be too expensive. So for example, they would inflate the cost of renewable energy. They would assume in some of their models that renewable energy would always be 8 times expensive as fossil fuels forever, for 100 years into the future. And of course, you're going to find that it's expensive if you assume that. And then, as far as the benefits of climate action, they completely ignored those. They didn't even attempt to calculate that. So with this approach, they could only find that it's expensive. And the thing is, it worked. Basically a lobbying strategy that it appears to be science, but it's essentially lobbying. And it worked. And it wasn't just American policy in the United States. It was also aimed at the international treaty process, like the Kyoto Protocol, and at the COP meetings that we were just talking about. So this is super important. I know that there might be some economists out there who don't want the scrutiny, or feel maybe a bit offended that the discipline's coming under greater scrutiny, or they think this is the way that the field works. But it's the planet that's at stake. Everything is at stake. And so it's not worth it to sacrifice the planet for the sake of keeping a certain economic ideology alive that just happens to exist at this time in history. um, so I think it's very important. It's not just the consulting firms, it's also the academic groups that are funded by the oil industry. Some of them are using similar methodologies. So all of this for the public good, it has to come under much greater scrutiny, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned early on in the paper that there's the two other economists as well who weren't involved in the study that you were talking about, but William Nordhaus of Yale University and Thomas Schelling of Harvard. Now, these are very well thought of institutions, but their theories, I mean, I have to say, I have a basic science bachelor's, and their theories are really they're wild. I mean, you just can't believe you're reading it. Do you want to maybe tell our audience a little bit about what their theories are about climate change and how they'll affect society?
Absolutely. This was back in the early 1980s when, some big scientific reports came out in the US about climate science, what's the future of climate change. And, these two very famous economists that you mentioned, they basically said, yeah, it might be bad, but we'll probably just adapt to it. Society is very malleable and adaptable. And I mean, that's fine as a guess, as a hypothesis, but to sort of jump to that conclusion and then impose the risk of global warming on everybody in the future, is pretty unethical, and it's not rigorous. It's not really a logical conclusion. It's more like wishful thinking more than anything else. So even though these people are very famous, even though they come from prestigious institutions, and it's an example of a broader point, which is that just because somebody's from a fancy, university or something, or has a fancy title, it doesn't mean that their conclusion is, valid, or that it's that it's robust or well thought through. And I think this is especially true for climate, because there's so much money at stake and so much at stake for, different industries and all of that, that there has been a lot of sort of, I guess you would call it like poor quality analysis. Um, and everyday people who might not be technical experts, they might feel like, well, I don't know what to think. I'm not like an expert in this area. But that's why we need to, I'm a big fan of broadening the tent and sort of democratizing the discussion, because it shouldn't be controlled by just a few technical experts. And as we're seeing, sometimes their analyses aren't even that good. So um, that's, I think a broader lesson.
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising for me as well that the US National Academy of Science, the report in 1983, unfortunately signed off on some of these economists and their quite spurious predictions. Why did this happen? I mean, it was disappointing for me to realize it was a physicist who signed off on this. And you have a PhD in applied physics. How did you feel about that when you read that?
There was a lot of evidence to the contrary by that point. I mean, 15, 20 years of research saying that it was down to human actions that were warming the planet. There was a huge amount of evidence, but as Karen said, they just went against that. Why?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, I'm actually interested in investigating that question. Why, despite all the evidence, uh, did these people sign off on the idea that we shouldn't do anything? And, were there special interest pressures there? Maybe it was purely ideology, but maybe there are other pressures as well. So to me, that's a important historical question to understand. Um, but I think, that early 80s is a really important time for climate change, because by that point, scientists had figured out how fast climate change was going to progress. They figured out how sensitive the earth is to more carbon dioxide. So that allowed them to predict, if we use this much fossil fuel, this is how much global warming will result. So they knew that by 1980. And by 1980, companies like Exxon were doing internal analyses that were predicting, okay, what can we do to avoid a CO2, a carbon dioxide buildup. So that was the fork in the road. By that time, history could have been different and should have been different. And instead of going for the safer path, the industry went for the more dangerous path for everyone. And so that's a really important part of the history. And it's important to realize that the way things have turned out was not inevitable. uh, there were choices, there were forks in the road, just like our future right now is not inevitable one way or the other. It's unwritten. It depends on what we do. So, when I think about the history of climate, I really think about that 1980 as like things could have been different from then, and we would have a very different present now had they been.
Yeah, the David Montgomery report of 1991 seems to me to emphasize also politicians' over reliance on a couple of metrics. We've discussed this with other economists as well, GDP or GNP, when clearly it seems to me that you, as a politician, you would need to look at multiple measures. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this comes from the macroeconomic paradigms or ideologies that have become dominant. I mean, one of the ideologies that these economists use was the assumption that everything is working optimally in the absence of regulation, in the absence of government action, which of course is a completely, wrong assumption to make. And it's untestable. So it's not really a scientific hypothesis, even. It's more just something to take on faith. And that's a very long, it's a very old kind of way of thinking about the economy, that a free market, optimizes itself or finds an optimal equilibrium. Things like that are creeping into this analysis, right? And then you have those outputs like you know GDP and so on, these macroeconomic outputs that don't look at all about, okay, how is this actually affecting people's lives individually? Is this a healthy economy or is it not? Yeah, we need a completely different way of thinking about economics. And if you think about climate change as a economic mismanagement problem, it's huge. It's terrible. I mean, that a society will knowingly and intentionally decide to create a global disaster for itself, um, and think that that's economically wise or even optimal is like very silly. And you know, I wonder how people will think 100 or 200 years from now, looking back at us today. But definitely, economics needs a much closer look and new ways of thinking.
Professor Stephen Keen, who we've interviewed on the show, has said that everyone knew what the problems were. The economists knew they could have been developing models, and we could have had a very different future. So he completely backs up your point there.
Yeah, I was going to say that you also mentioned in your paper Lorenzetti et al. 1996, and they state that the IPCC was government by stealth. And that remark seems to me to suggest a very libertarian mindset amongst
Mhm.
the oil and gas aristocracy. Do you think that is their mindset?
I think so, yes. I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, in the United States at least, the tobacco industry would fight against tobacco regulation by fighting against all regulation, by fighting against the idea of regulation and creating a whole ideological or intellectual pipeline, from universities to lobbying groups, different think tanks, and so on, or even just influencing, the American mindset. And of course, this applies globally. And so there is that long history of big business interests fighting against the very concept of regulation in general. And it goes all the way back. You can go back to like 100 years ago, and it's kind of the similar battles that are being fought in the United States. Things like the New Deal, and all of that. That was fought by big business interests and so on as well. So this has been a long running battle. it's a battle over power and money and wealth. And, you know, it's sort of like kind of takes you all the way back to Marx in a way, like this sort of battle over, you know, who controls politics by controlling, you know, resources and money, and how do the two intertwine. But yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, it's not just a fight against fossil fuel regulation. For many of these industries, it's a fight against the idea of regulation in general.
So it seems very much to me a tactic of the oil and gas aristos, I would put them, to almost require some form of genuflection from the general public and politicians because they provide so many jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating issue is, you know, what are the sources of the oil industry's power politically, right? I mean, at least in the United States, they don't employ that many people. It's not a super labor intensive industry. It's very profitable. And, you know, it kind of goes without saying, like, you know, the industry is politically powerful. But I mean, it's a great question to understand, well, what exactly are the sources of its power? And the reason it's important is because those are the intervention points to erode its power, which is necessary, you know, to get fossil fuels replaced as rapidly as possible. So I don't know what it's like in Scotland, but you know, I'd I'd love to learn about that.
Well, yeah, the oil and gas industry here, for the last few years hasn't paid any tax. There's been no
Hmm.
revenue paid into the exchequer, and obviously, when we're talking about profit, it's the profits made by the shareholders of these companies. So of course they're paying salaries for workers, but there's not a
Hmm.
huge amount of profit that
Yeah,
comes back into the economy, and it's not a
ultimately decided to destroy that society knowingly. So and that's sort of that's a historical tragedy, that change.
Yeah, and as well as that implied fear of the loss of work and employment,
Hmm.
there's also the Charles River Associates very much emphasised that there would be an extra tax burden.
Hmm.
If we went down with this regulation, there'd be an extra tax burden. So there was another reason to fear this regulation.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that these economists usually formulate their talking points is to say, this is how much GDP it'll cost, this is how many jobs it'll cost, and this is how much it'll cost the average family, you know, say $4,000 a year. And, you know, that's very effective because, you know, uh, it gets, you know, politicians' attention, and it gets in, you know, individual families' attention. And those are the talking points they've continued to use for decades. And you know, I noticed this trend actually accidentally back in 2017 when I was doing historical research. I was reading through the historical newspaper record to do some climate change history research, and I noticed these economists coming up again and again. And at that time, then President Trump was withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, and he gave a speech to that effect and cited some economic statistics that sounded really familiar. They were exactly in that format, and I thought it was weird that any economist would, you know, be coming up with that. So I tracked down the study that he cited, and it was by the exact same individuals who had been, you know, I'd just been reading about in the newspaper records from, you know, the early to mid 90s. So I stumbled on that accidentally. And, you know, but it goes to show that that strategy has been used, you know, for decades. And our ears should perk up a little bit when we hear those statistics, you know, being used to fight against climate policy. You know, I think our ears should perk up, and we should think, well, okay, you know, who's funding this, and is this really, does this study even really make sense, or are they just trying to scare us into inaction?
it takes a lot, a lot of hard work to look into these surveys and these research projects just to understand them. It's
Hmm.
not. it's not normal for someone to look at a statistic and think, I wonder
Yeah.
what the methodology is that's brought us to that. That seems, really difficult. And, it's amazing that we've got people like you who are able and willing to spend the time to look into that. It was when I read your paper, and it was incredible, the level of detail, but nothing surprised me.
Hmm.
And I think you mentioned a couple of times the tobacco industry as a reference. And we've known for 30 years that the tobacco industry knew the damage that nicotine was doing and didn't do anything about it. So when I was reading that the oil industry was doing the same, it was this kind of like, well, of course we were. And do you think is that a similar reaction that you've heard from other people? And if it is, what does it tell us about the society that we've got as we head into a climate crisis?
I mean, that's a really profound question. If something's not surprising us, but it's, arguably wrong or evil or destructive, then we have to ask ourselves why we weren't, why are we complacent about it? And are we complacent about it? And, I've spoken to many different economists who've worked, in the policy arena, and some of them said, well, this is just the way the game is played. And my reaction to that was, I mean, that has to be unacceptable. That has to be unacceptable. That can't be something that's normalized, from an ethical point of view. And so, yeah, I think there is a lot of what was, we might call malignant normality, meaning a situation that is normalized, but it is unhealthy and damaging. And I think that's happened with climate sort of delay and stasis, the that we tolerate year on year of inaction. Um, but yeah, it's it really raises some questions. It really does.
It brings to mind the arguments and the discussions we had around Brexit.
Yeah.
And we heard from the Leave, never listen to experts, and don't listen to experts. And at the time, a lot of people were riling against that.
Yeah.
But there's some truth in that from the discussion that
Hmm.
both of you have been having, isn't there? Just because someone is an economist or says scientist, you still just can't think, well, just because they've said that, it has to be true. You have to look into it. But the flip side of that is that if these people are saying this, you really need to give it some time to look into the details of it compared to just listening to random people. So I do think there's definitely a difficulty with us looking at these reports and say, well, that's what you get when people don't put enough time and effort into it.
And it raises a few things. I mean, one of the strategies that these industries use is they'll put out reports that are not like peer reviewed or anything. They sort of self-publish them, might be a white paper as they're called or something like that. And sometimes they're really long, like they're 400 pages long. So it makes it almost impossible to review it and understand and evaluate it, how credible and trustworthy is it. And that's one of the problems too. And, you know, yeah, there's a sort of this debate about cultural debate about, what's the role of experts, what's the role of expertise. And, it's funny. I grew up in a really small town in Iowa in the US, and, town of about 1,000 people, very rural. And, there wasn't a sort of hierarchy, social hierarchy of expertise that you have in urban centers with, professionals making a lot of money and so on. And so in my heart, I empathize with this idea that, we should think for ourselves, that we shouldn't just say, oh, this person said that, so that's the truth. So, it really does raise a big issue. But I think at the end of the day, one reason that people don't believe experts is because the status of being an expert has been abused by some people,
Mm.
right? I mean, this economist example is a perfect one. It's saying, well, I'm the expert, I'm the economist, this is how much, climate policy costs, and they don't expect people to look, behind the curtain, look under
Yeah.
the hood. And so it's really on, the people who are in positions of authority and public trust. They have to take care not to abuse their position, because when they do, it rightfully erodes trust.
Mm.
It erodes trust in experts, and that's the logical outcome of abusing that position. So
Yeah.
that I think that's an important part of this.
I mean, that takes us into kind of greenwashing and astroturfing, and that famous example of the Clean Water. Was it the Clean Water Association being run by all the major polluters? These things really do challenge our belief system, because we assume that there's some kind of rigorous process going on behind these things. And I think it is really important that the media call out, these, when they see this kind of astroturfing, or this deliberate delay and denial, to call it out. I wanted to ask you about one of the most colourful characters in Scotland. He's Sir Ian Wood. What do you think of his starring cameo in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum debate? Is this a type of overtly political lobbying commonplace in the US? And what does it say about the complicity of the media, that they're happy to just cut and paste views like his about oil, and in a way almost transpose his views as if he's some kind of authority on the climate?
No, completely. And thanks for bringing him up. I wasn't familiar with him, but I looked at the links that you sent me, and one thing that struck me about what he said is that he warned that Scotland was going to run out of oil in 35 years. It's, to me, that's a strange statement, because we can't be using much oil in 35 years. And fossil fuel production globally has to decline immediately, starting now. And so there's sort of this denial by action. It's sort of like, it's kind of hard to find somebody who says, I completely don't believe in climate science, or I don't believe in the greenhouse effect. But they'll go on with their life as if it's not real. And so statements like, oh my gosh, we're going to run out of oil in 30 years. It's like, well, I mean, if we're serious about climate change, if we're talking about meeting goals of the Paris Agreement or limiting global warming, then we can't be using much oil in 35 years. So, there is sort of this contradiction, and also this idea that, well, if we don't produce it, then we're simply going to import it from somewhere else, and they do a dirtier job than we do, so it's going to be bad for the environment. And that's a classic talking point for basically maintaining the status quo. And it's wrong, because we know that demand for something is not a fixed quantity. It's not a static amount. It depends on supply. Supply side policies, they do make a difference, and I think that they have to be a big part of what countries do going forward. And I mean, I was gonna I was gonna say that, it's amazing that people, even someone, of advanced years, can suffer from a short-sightedness, right? A myopia, um, as appears to be the case here, where, you know, in the long run, the entire world has to get off of oil and other fossil fuels, right? And so the question is, how do we do that? So, I see that it's kind of more of the same. These, little intellectual tricks, basically, to keep things in place, keep going with business as usual, and that is ultimately going to be a very bad outcome for the whole world if we do that.
I want to just take you back to that kind of overtly political. He made that statement during the independence
Yeah,
debate, and the article that was written up in the Herald, I think it was, said an independent Scotland will run out of oil in 35 years,
yeah,
and
yeah,
not Scotland. An independent Scotland, as if that our wells were going to be a lot not as deep as soon as we became independent. Business as usual thing, I think, is also interesting. And in that article around Aberdeen University divesting, I think they had a stat that 81% of people who were interviewed in the oil and gas industry would be happy to retrain in
Yeah.
renewables. And
Yeah.
again, you can't be surprised by that. It's not like these people are going to go, no, I want to be covered in oil every day. This is my
Yeah.
life. And
Exactly.
but again, you will hear this that there's so many jobs, as if these jobs just disappear
Hmm.
rather
Hmm.
than go on and do something else. So it's the whole there's a whole variety of ways that we're bringing in. The media is so important, but also the politics to continue this drilling and use of fossil fuels. So as we lead up to COP26, and someone from a different generation from Kieran and I, what do you expect to come out of COP26? What's your thoughts on what an impact and what difference it will make?
I'll be just very blunt. I I don't expect much. I don't mean that as to be, critical or anything, but it's I think it's, we've had meetings like this for, 25 years or so. And what do we have to show for it? What do we have to show for it? And maybe there's a good answer to that. I mean, maybe we do have a lot to show for it. But I see a lot of people going to the conferences. I see a lot of people making, announcements about things that they're going to do with their business or with their government, and then nothing changes, And so I want to be positive and optimistic about, the process, and I hope that something significant comes from it. But, you know, it's important that, things tangibly change, that things rapidly change. And, the idea that, oh, well, we can't announce our new policy until there's a COP meeting or something. I mean, that's a public relations approach to climate change, not a disaster avoidance approach. That's not a crisis approach to climate change. That's when can we make our announcement to get good publicity? So, and again, this is a question where I don't have a lot of special knowledge or expertise on that. I mean, I've never been to a COP meeting. I've always kind of wondered why people will go to them. Like, it's like kind of like going to a boxing match and like thinking that your attendance will influence the outcome. I mean, it could be interesting to go still.
We need to be talking about net zero by 2030. And
Hmm.
2050 is just it is a pathway that's just far too far.
Absolutely. It's so easy to kick the can down the road. And, now we're seeing that with the net zero framing. I mean, I personally, I think that net zero as a term is misleading inherently because it implies that we have processes for, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And of course, technologically we do, but carbon capture is very expensive. So that really raises the question of, is that going to be economically viable? And things like planting forests and stuff like that. I mean, that doesn't really take carbon out of the coupled biosphere atmosphere system, right? It doesn't put it back into that geologic reservoir where the fossil carbon originally came from. So that's not a reversal of the process either. And so, you know, but it's still being adopted, this net zero, language. And so I worry that the international you know, bureaucracy, essentially. It wants to save face, I think. And, so it's going to continue with the pledges. Now, I don't want to sound like I, don't think we should have an international process. I think we should. But it just has to be more effective, and it has to be based on more than just, promises and pledges and things like that. Um, And it also shouldn't give false assurances. You mentioned the fact that already groups are trying to flex beyond 2 degrees Celsius. And there is this pattern of like, don't worry, it's under control, we'll fix it, and then not doing anything. And ultimately, that's a really unethical thing to do, I think. So
There's a lot
those,
of
yeah.
belief in international agreements that stems from the Millennium Development Goals,
Hmm. Hmm.
because they were really successful and what they were
Yeah.
targeting, they had a lot of success. And I think the international community think, well, the Sustainable Development Goals can have the same type of success. But the one difference I would highlight is that the Millennium Development Goals were all improved by growth,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
sustainable development goals are all negatively impacted by growth if they're taken globally, and that's a huge difference. If you're
Hmm.
encouraging a country to grow and to achieve all the things it can do with a little bit of growth, then that's very different from saying to a lot of countries you can't grow and you've got to stop growing. So I think the idea that we can just transpose the success from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals are proving to be really difficult because of the fixation on growth. And that's what we cover quite a lot
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
Scotonomics, is this fixation on growth.
I guess I just wanted to say a couple of things to you both about COP26, and
Hmm.
to put a maybe more optimistic note.
Yeah. Yeah. Please do.
Before, yeah, because
So,
what I would say is over my lifetime, I'll be 55 in November. So, the Club of Rome published their book in 1972 when I was 6.
mhm.
And, that information was coming out then. I think that young people now are much more educated about climate change than we were then. I mean, I picked up on it. I was the kid that watched a little news program for children. I was picked up on that then. So certainly I would say quite a few young people that I've spoken to in Aberdeen who are working in the oil industry don't want to be in it. They understand
Mhm.
what it's doing and they are trying to get out of the oil industry. I think people in general, certainly there's some that I've read some evidence on this, that they've done experiments with rats where literally they will not jump out of a maze until there's a fire behind them, and I think to a certain extent, that is how people respond. But I think the fire is here, and I think a lot of people could see the fire. It's in places that they know, so maybe people didn't notice that India had 50 degrees a few years ago, but they're noticing Greece and they're noticing
Mhm.
America and they're noticing Germany. And it's the powerful people in the north noticing that they actually have the power to do something about it. I think the other thing I would really like to see happening, and I think we all need to encourage everyone in politics that we know about this, is the governments need to be scrutinising all these types of evidence. And if they're
Mhm.
not employing enough people to do it, they need to employ more people to do that. So yeah, I'm hopeful that there's a lot of young people I really feel really passionate and serious about this, and I think they will move the narrative. I really am hopeful about that.
That would be amazing. And, I think things are changing. I mean, if we look at the last 10 years, social movements around the world to do with climate change have grown immensely in power and size and diversity of strategies and things like that over the last 10 years. The technology continues to change, and the market position of the fossil fuel industry continues to be eroded over time. And even the legal movement to hold fossil fuel companies and governments accountable for their inaction or their deceptions, that is also a powerful front that has emerged lately. So I think all of these things sort of couple together. They all move together and reinforce each other. And hopefully that will also feed into the COP process and make that process even, well, make it more powerful, hopefully. Yeah.
My concern is that the best outcomes of COP26 are not going to be anywhere near enough. And
Yeah.
I think that is commonly understood, that if we're pushing towards 1.5, there's nothing, the pathways to 1.5 I think are behind us, and
Hmm.
and that's a huge issue, as you said at the start. So I think even if we come out and we do make some progress towards maybe dropping it down to 2045, there's still that huge misunderstanding, and this is, again, I doubt you'll be aware of this, but this is directly impacting Scotland, because a lot of companies are buying land to plant trees in the Highlands of
Mm-hmm.
Scotland. So
Mm-hmm.
Scotland has, there's something like 500 people own half of Scotland. It's the most,
Wow.
I think it's only Brazil that has more of a
Concentrated.
small, a concentrated
Uh-huh.
share of private land. And that's going to intensify with these companies buying huge tracts to plant, you know, one type of tree. And
Mm-hmm.
this is such a huge impact. And I think when things like that have an impact, you know, it's maybe it's not floods or temperature, but when we can start to see that the amount of land that we control, which is already so small,
Mm-hmm.
is diminishing. And also, you
Mm-hmm.
know, we've got things like our peatlands. There's 1.7 billion tons of
Mm-hmm.
carbon stored in our peatlands. If I was to overlay, which I have done, if I overlay who owns the land on top of where all the peatlands are, it's almost exclusively private land. So how can
Mm-hmm.
we move to a green transition when we don't have any control
Yeah.
of the land? So
Mm-hmm.
huge issues
Mm-hmm.
that every country in the planet is
Mm-hmm.
experiencing around climate. And as Kieran said, I think if you can focus on that and get people motivated about the thing that's the fire behind them in the maze, then I do think we have that. But I just can't see it for this COP. You know, maybe the one after.
So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I do think that all of these small things together will create a big thing. And I'm hopeful. I think, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and also I think the fact that I'm doing this climate change litigation is actually inspiring a few people round about me. So, and if they get involved and they do more, then that will inspire people round about them. So I think it is all incremental, but I think we're coming
Mm-hmm.
to a critical mass of, you know, that it will come together.
Well, the power is definitely in knowledge, and we would encourage everyone to spend a good half an hour in reading your paper because it really does shed a light on what we know is not just happening in the US, but globally, and specifically those few comments of yours that show that Scotland is certainly not immune from the delay and the denial that's been happening in the US. Ben, thanks very much for your time. It's been great talking to you, and all the best.
Thank you very much. It's
Ben.
great to chat. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Hi, Kieran, are you with us? Oh, you're a little bit pixelated. Let's see how your volume
I'm with
is.
you.
Oh,
I'm with
great,
you.
great. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that. It was great to have two really inspirational people talk about their campaigning on the climate crisis, Kieran and Ben. We've had loads of comments about Ben and a lot of people watching tonight, so thanks very much for that. Kieran, any thoughts before we head off for the night?
Yeah, so I just wanted to flag up something to our viewers. It's a fantastic film that I showed to Transition Town Tayport about 12 years ago. It's called The Age of Stupid. It's currently available on the iPlayer, on the BBC iPlayer, on Channel 4 on the BBC iPlayer. It really is a clarion call, and it had a profound effect on me, and I would really recommend it to people to watch that. And maybe you want to tell people what we've got going tomorrow night as well, William.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant point that you made about that film. What year was it made?
12 years ago it came out. The director, Franny Armstrong, flagged it up yesterday.
It's incredible because we've known these things for, as Ben said, since initial reports from the 60s, through to real kind of proper science saying here's the timeline of this in the 80s and the 90s. We've known about it right through the last 20 years, and it's only really now that there seems to be some kind of momentum to make a difference, and that momentum is taking us through this whole week with shows. So we had Ben tonight. Tomorrow we have a brilliant, real kind of in-depth geopolitical look at the climate crisis with Fadel Kaboud, and we get into a lot of really interesting ideas around climate debt and reparations and social justice, and some of the figures that Fidel talks about just seem absolutely monumental in terms of the wealth that's gone from the global south to the global north and how we have to look at climate in the context of that. That's absolutely fantastic session tomorrow. And then on Wednesday we have a live session, an actual bona fide live with our guest live, Richard Murphy, and we're going to get into details of the Green New Deal. And I said certainly think that's probably going to be one of the most important episodes that we've got this year, because it covers the climate crisis, but it also covers monetary sovereignty and fiscal deficits and job guarantee scheme and all of these other issues. And Richard is probably one of the people across the globe who is most knowledgeable about the Green New Deal, having proposed it, a number of years ago. So that's going to be a fantastic episode as well. So 3 episodes from us this week. I really hope you can join us again, or catch up, because I know how busy everyone is. But thanks so much for joining. Kieran, thanks so much for tonight, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.